Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be continuing our discussion and overview of the early church that will lead into the Middle Ages. So this is covering from when we finished off last time, ending around 250 AD to about 500, 600 AD. So let's go ahead and get started. So what ended up happening was at the end of 250, what we began to see is growth taking place for the church. More Christians are joining the church, especially in the East. But by 250, there began to be statewide persecutions against Christians, the official imperial persecutions designed specifically targeting Christians. This began under Emperor Decius in about 249. Roughly, the reason cause for this statewide persecution was this was the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Rome, and so Decius wanted to point out that the problems that the empire was facing was primarily due to Christians existing, that these crises of the 3rd century with these constant imperial overthrows and assassinations and Germanic invasions and famines are the Christians' fault. And so began to specifically target Christians in this empire-wide persecution. Began to arrest and round up Christian leaders and demanding that Christians offer sacrifices. In fact, an empire-wide sacrifice. Everybody in the Roman Empire must offer sacrifice and obtain a proof of having committed that sacrifice. And of course, we have actual of those permits still today preserved from this time period. His successor, Valerian, continued that persecution against Christians. We see also added that the banning of Christian meetings taking place as well, targeting Christian churches by Emperor Valerian. And so it kind of comes to an end with his son Gallienus, roughly in the 260s. He ends the persecution against Christians and realizing that it's not making a dent really into destroying the Christian church. Instead decides to attack Christianity intellectually, developing, utilizing pagan writings and Hellenistic writings to try to refute the teachings of Christianity. In this time period, what we also see is the beginning of sun worship, which was promoted by Emperor Aurelian. Sun worship primarily was a way to address monotheism. And so that you still had all the main Olympian gods, all the pagan gods, but there's one supreme being behind all these Olympian gods, and that's the sun. And so honoring the sun and worshiping the creator's sun was the means of trying to address monotheism. It was especially popular among the Roman military. We also see Platonism evolve into kind of Neoplatonism, thanks to the writings of Plotinus, who argued that there is one being, this one or this God or this reason behind everything in the universe, and that out of the one came the mind, and the mind created the world soul, and the world soul led to nature and matter. So there's kind of a hierarchical de-escalation from there, and so it's the goal of the Neoplatonists to have one soul return in essence back to the mind and back to the one, through self-discipline and other practices like asceticism and things. And Neoplatonism was very popular among pagans, and a lot of Christian thinkers and theologians from this time period took a lot of Neoplatonist ideas into Christian theology as well, and it was popular. There were many converts from Neoplatonism to Christianity. We also have Manichaeism that appeared as well in this time period under the supposed Persian prophet Mani, who took a mixed match of different ideas of like Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity and formulated this religious belief that there's a balance between light and dark. This is war, conflict between two sides. That's the goal of the person, to purify the darkness out of them and to enhance the light within them. And you do that through a very strict moral code. You're celibate, you can't own property, you use reason, you reject the Old Testament, and so you use these different things to enhance oneself. Also an important note, by this time period too, we see the first Christian kingdom appear. The kingdom of Armenia becomes a Christian kingdom in 301 AD. There's a kind of a miraculous account involving the king who was blind or such, and receiving his sight, and therefore allowing and then promoting Christianity from within. So it's a very unique story. We really don't have a whole lot of time to get into here today, but just wanted to make an important note. So the persecution picks up again under Emperor Diocletian. Now, the persecution lasts from 303, 304 to 311. Now, Diocletian is unique from many different things, but first thing I want to talk about is he helps reorganize the Roman Empire. He realizes that as it's difficult to deal with a lot of issues, whether it's invasions, financial issues, corruption, the attack by the Persians in the east, an emperor can't deal with this all by himself. And so what he does is he creates what's called tetrarchy. In a sense, he makes think of it like two presidents and two vice presidents. And so it's two Augustuses and two Caesars. There's an Augustus Caesar in the east, and there's an Augustus and Caesar in the west. Diocletian is the head of all of them. He is the Augustus in the east, and he has a Caesar assisting him. And there's an Augustus in the west with a Caesar assisting him. But Diocletian begins to target Christians by this time period. It becomes of all record of our martyrs in the early church, 1/3 of them come out of this 7-year persecuted period. And so he begins to arrest and round up Christian leaders, have them tortured, executed, destruction of church buildings, demanding of handing in Christian scriptures to be burned and destroyed, universal sacrifices being instituted, so that way you could prove that you weren't a Christian. And what we noticed more so is that the persecution was definitely worse in the east than it was in the west part of the Roman Empire. And it's for different reasons, mostly demographic. You have to understand in the east, there was a lot more Christians than there were in the west. Doesn't mean there weren't any Christians in the west, but remember, Christianity started in Jerusalem and spread outwards. The east was much more urbanized with more cities and towns. It had a larger number of Christians living there, so it's easier to kind of spot and identify a Christian in the east, more so than it is in the west. The west did have major cities, but not as many as the east. A lot of rural small towns and such. So demographically, it was really harder to spot a Christian in the west. Also, one of the Caesars in the west was Constantius, the father of Constantine, who really didn't make it a goal to really persecute after Christians, and kind of placated the Emperor Diocletian and such. So this persecution goes on for quite a period of time, for 7 years. And so really it's brought to an end thanks to Constantius' son, Constantine. Diocletian is one of the few emperors to actually go in retirement. And also another point too about Diocletian is that before he retires, he reorganizes the Roman Empire's province system, and so they're called dioceses, which is what the Roman Catholic Church uses today to organize its church structure and its regional church structure. So that term diocese is still continued today. It can be traced back to Diocletian. So Constantius dies. His son Constantine is nominated by Constantius' soldiers as the Caesar in the west. When Diocletian goes in retirement, he thought that the Augustus in the west would go in retirement with him. He does, but then he comes back, and pretty much there's almost like a 5-way Roman civil war among these different Caesars and Augustus for sole power of Rome. And so Constantine invades. He invades Italy and goes into war against Maxentius, another rival emperor. And outside of Rome at the Milvian Bridge, they have the kind of final conflict. And this is one of those legendary shifting points in history where supposedly Constantine has a vision the night before, where Christ reveals himself and shows him, by this sign you shall conquer, which is the famous Chi-Rho symbol, which you see on here on the slide. It's the first initials of the word Christ. And so what Constantine does is he has the Chi-Rho symbol painted on the shields of the soldiers, and then they attain a great victory. And so now what we see with Constantine's victory and the defeat of Maxentius and the reunification of the West, because in the East, Licinius is one of the other emperors who kind of takes control of the East. And so we have these two emperors, one in the West, one in the East. They both agree to cease persecution of Christianity and to make Christianity a legal religion, because remember, up to this point, it was an illegal religion. And so it could not exist by the state standards, so it had to be persecuted out. But now it could be a tolerated and acceptable religion within the Roman Empire. So for the first time in church history, it's now considered a legal religion. though Constantine's relationship with Licinius becomes a little strained. And then eventually in 324, he defeats Licinius and becomes the sole master of the Roman Empire. Now, he is the first emperor that we have that has a positive attitude towards Christianity. And he makes a lot of steps into kind of fusing state and church together and binding them together. And these have huge implications into the medieval period, especially in the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And so one of the things we see, and this is kind of in today's terms too, if you have a very important political figure that shows favoritism to one thing, a lot of people in the imperial system or outside the imperial system who wants to gain favor of that individual will also show the same favoritism. So we start seeing a lot of pagans converting over to Christianity, kind of in response to the favoritism of Constantine. But Constantine does many different things as well. One is he has a spiritual advisor named Hosius Cordova, who is an important figure, especially in the Council of Nicaea that we see later. He makes Sunday the official day of rest. He also incorporates bishops into the legal system. So now bishops can try legal cases. And so now they're part of the bureaucratic system. And that's going to play an important role in help to set up the structure and organization of the church, because now it's almost, in a sense, tied with the imperial state. And you can see right there, he ordered the construction of churches, especially the Lateran Palace in Rome, which is why it considered itself the mother of all churches, because it's the first church issued and built by the Roman Empire. But one of the big things too is that he moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople in the east. He builds a new city on the site of Byzantium. Constantinople becomes the new official capital and becomes kind of the center point for the Eastern Church as well as the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, real quickly, so since Constantine sees himself in a sense as a guardian of the empire, but also in a way a guardian of the church, and gets himself involved with particular controversies that appear in the church. I'm going to be talking about Arianism later, so I really won't talk about it here, but you can kind of see what he does. But really talk about Donatism here real quick. There was a kind of split that was happening in the North African church over the election of a bishop named Cassalian. The problem was Cassalian did two things happened to Cassalian. One was he ran afoul of supposedly a Roman noblewoman who was kissing relics and things like that. So part of the reason was he ran afoul of somebody. But then two was there was an argument between him, Cassalian being elected bishop, and another man named Donatus. And the issue was people who support Donatus accused Cassalian of not being properly ordained, because the man who ordained Cassalian turned in scriptures to be burned and destroyed during the persecution, and therefore lost his right. It was considered a lapsed Christian and such, and a kind of an apostate. And so because of that man, because considered apostate, he had no authority to ordain Bishop Cassalian or Cassalian into the priesthood. And so Cassalian wasn't technically ordained by Donatist standards and by the Donatist supporters. And so a big conflict broke out over who was elected bishop. And also this involves church property as well. So Constantine sees himself as need to be involved in this issue. And so he orders actually a council, the Council of Arles, which comes first before the Council of Nicaea, to kind of address this issue. The Donatists ultimately lose. Cassalian is nominated as bishop of Carthage. And so the Donatists decide to split and form their own church in response to this actions. And so now there's a split in the North African church. At first, Constantine tries to kind of bring them in, but then eventually the Roman imperial system begins to target and persecute the Donatists. And then Augustine himself, as we'll see later, kind of gets involved in the argumentation against the Donatists. So after Constantine and his successors, what's the relationship between Christianity and the empire? What are some of its approaches and changes? Christianity continues to grow as more and more pagans begin to convert into Christianity. There's still much resistance in the West, in the rural areas, that's where we kind of get the term pagans from, paganoi, which it's kind of like an insult, means like a redneck or a hick. And so these pagans refuse to convert over to Christianity. So there is resistance in the western part of conversions more so than in the east. At one point, there was almost a switch back to paganism. Julian the Apostate, who grew up during these theological controversies that we'll talk about later with Arianism and such, or not Arianism, but the Christological controversies and the back and forth between bishops in the church, kind of had an innate opposition to Christianity. And so from 361 to 363, tried to turn back the clock. He removed all Christian leadership from the bureaucracy of the empire. He also ordered the reconstruction of temples and reinstitution of sacrifices. He banned Sunday as a day of rest. He also tried to build a pagan church as a counterbalance to the Christian church. Ultimately, he died in campaign in the East, so a lot of his ideas never saw fulfillment, and pretty much died with him. Afterwards, after another series of emperors, and really there's a lot in between here. Well, we're going to be kind of jumping back and forth. Emperor Theodosius the First, or Theodosius the Great, does the final step in making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. There's no longer any other acceptable religion except for Judaism. He orders the destruction of temples. Temples are destroyed. Churches are being built. The academy in Athens is gone and done away with. And so we see here the kind of the final nail in the coffin for paganism, and also the beginning of that unification between the church and state in the imperial system. There's a conflict and this plays a role right into the medieval period of state and church, because now remember in the last lecture that the state saw itself as the guardian. The Roman state saw itself as the guardian of religion, and that, seeing omens and divination from the gods, especially for signs of approval for campaigns, laws, elections, and things like that, and a way to maintain good order in society. So now that idea still carries on, but now we have it with involving the church. And so there's a conflict, especially in the East and West, over this idea. How does the church and state interact with one another? The Caesars, the emperors, believe that they have God-given authority to do so, to interfere and guide and direct policy and product good conduct within the church. But there are bishops like Athanasius and Hosius who argue more so for church independence. The church itself, the bishops can guide and lead and provide that guidance and discipline in the church, not so much the emperor. Doesn't mean the emperor and the imperial system doesn't have a role in this relationship with the church, is that only the church deals with church matters. And this kind of separates in East and West. The Western church gravitates more and more to that idea and that separation and distinction between church and state, while the East gravitates more and more to kind of like a Caesaropapism, where there is where the church, the state, the emperor has the power to summon ecumenical councils, appoint bishops, and really dictate that policy to the different patriarchs across his part of the eastern part of the empire. And so that plan plays a role too in our minds of relationship in church and state today in the Western kind of Protestant Roman Catholic church systems versus the Eastern Orthodox. And one of the unique cases that we see that's taking place, especially in the West, is the life of Ambrose. One of the four doctors of the early church, that's considered is, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory, Pope Gregory the First. Ambrose has a unique background. He's actually a civil servant. He was a governor over the city of Milan, in the region, that kind of northern part of Italy. Milan is now technically the capital of the western part of the Roman Empire. Rome is more symbolically the capital, but the imperial government has moved to Milan. And so what's interesting is that Ambrose, as a governor, was dealing with an issue between factions in the church in Milan. There was an Arian party and an anti-Arian party that were fighting for power and control, and trying to elect a bishop. Ultimately, a child sees Ambrose and declares Ambrose for bishop, Ambrose for bishop. Everybody takes it as a sign from God, and therefore he is elected bishop, but he wasn't even ordained, so he wasn't going to complete his catechumen training, so they had to speedily get his catechumen training, made him a presbyter, and then make him a bishop, so that way he can hold that office. But it was in a sense a very great choice, because he was a great preacher, wrote many intellectual works and gave important sermons. He would have influence later on Augustine, wrote anti-Arian works, and we'll talk about that in the Arian controversy. He was known as a hymn writer as well, Te Deum. was associated with him. But big thing too was his relationship with Emperor Theodosius the Great. Two big incidences happen. One is that Theodosius orders the massacre of the people of Thessalonica because of their rioting, and has them all rounded up in the Circus Maximus and all killed. And so when Ambrose hears about this, he excommunicates Theodosius. And so it takes a couple months of forgiveness and demonstration of penance for Theodosius to finally be brought back into the church. But this is, so can you imagine here a bishop opposing and standing in opposition to one of the most powerful figures in the world at this time, which was Emperor Theodosius. And he also speaks a sermon against Theodosius as well, because Theodosius is trying to use funds to help rebuild a synagogue, and the funds should be, Ambrose argues that the funds should be going to help building churches, not other religious buildings. And so Theodosius is sitting in the congregation listening to the sermon being spoken against him. Naturally, he relents. But this relationship here between bishop and emperor has a lasting impact on the Western Church. We see this with relationships between like the Holy Roman Emperors and the popes and the power of the papacy, who holds authority and such. And so different people at different times are going to turn to these particular events as justification for their arguments. So with the ending of persecution, and now with the church and state working together, in a sense, what you have here is some teaching and organization changes that began to happen. One is the kind of officialization of the canon. Now, remember, like in the last lecture I talked about, the New Testament scripture did exist, was approved by the bishops, and was passed around and shared across the Roman Empire by many different churches. Especially when you look at the Marcionites, who are a Gnostic group that rejected rejected parts of the gospel, rejected parts of the New Testament. There obviously was a sense, and especially quotations by different early church fathers like Irenaeus and others of New Testament texts show that there was New Testament documents that did exist, and that they were treated as scripture as such. But what we have to realize too is at this point, because the church and state are closely related together, and then you have bishops trying legal cases, like any good bureaucrat, you're going to want a rubber stamp of approval by the state showing that, that there's an official document. So naturally, in a sense, there has to be kind of an official Bible. And so the state naturally, and the church wants naturally kind of like a rubber seal of approval on this document showing that, hey, this is the approved Bible. So in kind of the Council of Carthage, there's the supposed council, the Council of Nicaea 325, and then the Council of Carthage 396, you have the official canonization of scripture. But the scripture, New Testament scripture, did exist prior to this. It wasn't just a later development. It was passed around and shared. But during times of persecution and such, it's very difficult to have that kind of moment of sitting down, collecting together, and really organizing and shaping that document. But there were consistent the four Gospels, many of Paul's letters, and some of Peter's letters and John's letters that were treated as such as scripture, as New Testament scripture. There's also development changes in the organization. So what we have here, last time I talked about was you had the overseer / elder and the deacon, pretty much the presbyters and the deacon. And then out of the presbyters came, there's a, whether threefold or twofold ministry. There is, in a sense, that there was a senior presbyter over the other presbyters, or a bishop over these other presbyters. And so in a city, you might have multiple bishops running smaller communal communities of churches within a very large city. Now what happens is that over one city, you have one bishop that has kind of smaller presbyters who manage the small churches within that city. So you have one bishop over one city. And also what comes out of this too is the organization of the archbishop or the metropolitan bishop, and those deal with the provinces. So if you're working within the imperial system and you want to address an issue taking place within a particular city, it's easier to talk to one person than it is to talk to 20. And one person can better manage the affairs of the churches in that particular city than 20 individual people can. And so it's also easier if you can talk to one person, one bishop in a province who can then issue out letters and manage those other bishops those bishops within his territory. So so in a kind of bureaucratic organizational sense, it makes sense of this development. And then beyond that, above them is the patriarchs. So you have here the 5 key patriarchs of Rome, of Constantinople, of Antioch, of Jerusalem, and of Alexandria. And if you look on the map here, you notice that Rome gets a bigger slice of the pie than the other ones. And like I said, demographics play a big role, as well as regional issues as well. Like I said, Christianity was much more popular in the East, more so than it was in the West. It's growing in the West, but it's much more densely populated in the East than it is the West. So the slices of the pies make sense, one, because it provides a better balance of management between them. And what's even more fascinating is that there's a rivalry that begins to develop between the 5 patriarchs. Rome considers itself supreme because it's Rome, the founding city of the empire, and claims to the martyr bones of Peter and Paul. Alexandria views itself as the leader because it's the cultural capital of Rome, where a lot of key figures like Origen appeared, a lot of key writings. Antioch considered itself superior over the others because it's where it's the first Gentile church. Constantinople considered itself superior, even though it's viewed as a newcomer by the rest, because it's the imperial capital in the East. Jerusalem is more treated symbolically of the 5, and it's kind of like the kid brother of the 5. It's the symbolic capital, but it's never treated so much really equally on terms as the others. And there's going to be a very intense rivalry between Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople. It also doesn't help to, like we'll see next, is that regional arguments and regional languages and regional ethnicities begin to kind of compete against one another as well, and kind of separate one another and break apart really in the eastern part of the church. So originally in the church, Greek language, that Koine Greek, was what was spoken, primarily conducted in church worship services, but you start seeing incorporating different languages into liturgy: Latin in the West, Syriac in Syria, Coptic in Egypt. And these language liturgies is what's really going to help break apart the church in like the 1054 Great Schism between East and West, because of the different language barriers that are taking place. There's many other factors, but one factor in itself is the separation by language, that language variation, because words have different meanings and different impacts and different emphasis. And as we'll see in those many controversies, they're going to play a role in shaping the split in the church. We see the development of different liturgies. There's the Roman and Gallican liturgy in the West. There's the Constantinopolitan and Alexandrian and Syriac liturgy in the East. So all these different liturgies and styles of worship, there are key themes. It's not that they're so radically different. You have the preaching of the sermon, the Lord's Supper, all singing, the chanting of psalms, singing of psalms, and so all these, in the reading of different Old Testament documents, all those are there, but there's different emphasis and different little variations. We also see the officialization of certain holidays, Christmas being set to December 25th. Some in the East celebrate on January 6th, but eventually many pull over into celebrating on December 25th. The development of Lent as a holiday and tying in with Easter week, because the official part of the church. We also see the beginnings of rituals and ceremonies. Clerical vestments begin to appear here in the 4th and 5th centuries, as well as incense. There's also a kind of a more ritualization for certain practices like baptism. And in a sense, it kind of makes sense. Remember, in this time period too, very rarely did anybody have access to the Bible. If you're a lay person in a church, you're probably illiterate, couldn't read. You really trusted your bishop to read it and to explain it to you. And these rituals were symbolic because they teach you different things about your faith and such. So, and for example, in baptism, the way it was conducted was, before you'd face the west and you would say you would renounce Satan, and then you face the east and you would say you accepted Christ, and then you were put into a kind of a baptismal pool, and there was a threefold immersion. And then there, with a kind of with a particular pattern of speech that was being used by the bishop, and then you're anointed with oil, the chrism, to showing your anointing by the Holy Spirit. And so there was an understanding that baptism kind of a few things, that baptism cleared away the guilt of sin, that and that baptism in of itself sanctified you and sealed you with the Holy Spirit. Now, it's not the baptism itself, but the Holy Spirit uh, working through the baptism that did these things. But the ritualization of that really began to take hold and shape, and ritual aspects began to really take hold in the 4th and 5th centuries. Beginning to invocate, in the invocation of saints and the cults of saints and relics really also began to take ground. A lot of the church fathers, Augustine, Ambrose, John Chrysostom, and others, didn't discourage it, and in some ways encourage these things. And so with that being said, it also makes sense to why this also began to take shape. One is a lot of pagan converts were coming into the church, bringing a lot of ideas and influences with them. But also in the ancient world too, there was very much an important understanding of the hierarchy of the ancient world, that you had the Caesar, you had the noble aristocrats, patricians, the common citizens, non-citizens, all these different ways of hierarchical structure of who can have influence with who can speak to who, and the relationship you have with that person or don't have with that person, the rights they possess and don't possess. So, you couldn't yourself directly walk into the emperor and speak to the emperor. You had to have the ear of somebody who had the ear of somebody who had the ear of somebody to get a message to the emperor. So the same idea kind of carried over into the church, is that, Christ is human, but also divine. I can't really speak to the deity. I can pray to Christ. And then, and of course, yes, praying to God was understood. That didn't stop, but there was an idea that if I want to convey a message to God and praying to God, I need to, best if somebody who understands me and hears me can get that message to God better. And so with saints and martyrs, they were considered holy individuals, and so if I communicate with them, they in turn can get that message across. So we see here the building of shrines over places where martyrs may have lived or died, shrines over the relics and bones of the saints and martyrs. And so if you touch them, maybe you can therefore have a direct line of contact, or if you stand in a place where they died, you might have a direct contact with them, and they in turn can help get your message across. And so we see this really develop here in the 4th and 5th and into the 6th century, and which why it becomes popular in the medieval period. We also see the beginning of icons in the church as well, which is fascinating, ultimately, because what ends up happening is there's a kind of a restructuring of the 10 commandments to kind of address this icon issue, is that they kind of take the 2nd commandment and slide it under the 1st as kind of like an addendum piece. And then they take the 10th commandment and break it in two. So you still have the 10 commandments. But in a sense, images and icons in the church are not necessarily a problem. There is a huge problem later on, the iconoclastic controversy that begins to take place in the East and in the West. But initially, early on, incorporating icons in the church began to start and spread, within the church and within established building it in the buildings and such. But there is a step here in that process where it begins to take place. So with the church now no longer being persecuted, there was a sense of, well, now there's all this sin and corruption. How can I best demonstrate my love for God if I can no longer, face that sense of persecution and have that sense of suffering for God? How can I suffer for him? And so we see in response to that an emergence of monasticism. There's different monastic community groups. You have the Eremitic, which was the one by themselves. They were like, the Saint Anthony of Egypt, the desert fathers who lived off in the desert by themselves in the East. Then you had the Cenobitic monastic communities. Those were the communal type. Those were the ones who lived in like monasteries as groups together, large groups together. And you have the Scitae monastic groups. Those were like small bands of like 12 guys working together. There were many different early desert fathers. Not really have time to get into all of them. Primarily, Antony is the one that's best known, as well as Pachomius. And we know Antony thanks to his biography being written by Athanasius, who writes down his experiences. Antony apparently went into a church, hearing a sermon saying, sell all you have, build up treasures for you in heaven. Takes that as a sign from God, sells all he has, goes live in the desert. In Egypt, faces wild animals, the elements, spirits, lusts, and conquers them all, and kind of comes out of this desert as this kind of like super spiritual figure that can conduct healing and has wise sayings. So it has these kind of rules that Athanasius kind of builds off of for living as a monk. And then Pachomius was a former soldier, but what he does in a sense is build a community of monks, of like-minded individuals. And it kind of takes the soldier's idea of living in the trenches together, working together to help fight against the kingdoms of darkness and living in that lifestyle together. And so and we help each other build each other up and such. So he builds this kind of early communal group and sets down rules about what should one follow in these communities. So we see this early take place in the monastic movement, and it begins to spread in the East and into the West. Monastic communities follow very strict practices of asceticism and self-denial, some very extreme to some very basic. They also began to practice celibacy. Now, what's interesting is that into the 4th and then the 5th centuries, what we have is bishops are being drawn from monastic communities. And it almost makes sense in a way too, because if you're a church group, and you're looking for a new bishop, right? You're less likely going to pick somebody who's involved within the sin and corruption of the world. And you want to pick that super spiritual person outside that seems like a charismatic leader. It's great, prays, he fasts, and knows scripture. And so you might choose that individual. And so monks began to become very popular and began to be made bishops over certain cities. Because monks were celibate, that's how celibacy began to be really introduced into the church in that vein. And so began to become very prominent expectation by clergies in the church. Later on, though, it's not officially demanded until the high point of the Middle Ages, until 1200s. We see that monastic communities in the East really focused on really supporting their communities by building inns, schools, and hospitals to help build up and take care of their community. It goes in the monasticism spreads westward thanks to two individuals, Martin of Tours as well as John Cassian. Really can't get into them, but note that John Cassian is kind of an antagonist to Augustine because John Cassian is a Semi-Pelagian and writes in arguments against Semi-Pelagianism, writes for Semi-Pelagianism against Augustine. But monasteries are important, and their development in the Western Europe is important because they really are the guardians of culture and education in the West, as there's a decline in culture and education. And so if you want to have your children educated to become part of a kingdom's bureaucratic government or to be better under noble and such, you wanted them to go into monasteries. And also, too, these monasteries acted as points of evangelism because many of the evangelistic movements, mission movements that happened in the early medieval period, especially, were done by monks. And so we'll talk about those here in a little bit, a few of them in this lecture, and then many more in the others to follow. But the monastic movement really began to take hold and shape in this time period. So with development here, persecution's over, but heresy still exists, and controversies become a major point in this period. We see the development of the Arian controversy and the Christological controversy. The Arian controversy is important because it addresses one of the issues of trying to understand how can God be both one and three? How do we understand the three and the one? Arius was a Presbyterian at Alexandria who argued that the Father alone was God, that Jesus was a created being. In a sense, he was eternal. He wasn't eternally begotten. He was eternal. He was created in some point in time past. And that way he addressed it in a sense of trying to address that particular issue about monotheism. So Origen like I said in the last lecture, Origen is very important to understand if you want to understand Eastern thought in the early part of the church. even though he's considered Origen's a controversial figure himself. Origen argued that the Logos was eternally generated, but also that Christ was created and had different grades of divinity. Um, Arius didn't accept that different grades, but he did accept the argument from Origen that Christ was created. And even, like I said, Origen had his own conflicting viewpoints. And so Arius began to promote this idea. The Bishop Alexander of Alexandria opposed him, formed a synod, had him banished. And so what Arius did was he kind of went on a political campaign in the East and collecting all these bishops saying, I was wrongly persecuted, I was wrongly banished. Here's my beliefs. It's in line with Origen. Like I said, there was a lot of confusing viewpoints and no one on understanding the Trinity. And so not a lot of bishops understood what was really going on. And so there was a big commotion taking place in the East, and it really a lot of infighting was taking place. And so we kind of go back in time here. Constantine decides to address this particular issue. He orders a council at Nicaea in 325. There's different numbers of how many bishops appear, but the usual average is about 300 bishops gathered together. There was a lot more that was addressed at Nicaea that we're not going to get into today, but primarily what came out the Council of Nicaea was the Nicene Creed. And so this really set down the understanding of the Trinity, addressing the Son's relationship with the Father, that the Son is homoousios, of the same essence. So the Son is also divine, eternal, unchanging, and uncreated, just like the Father. Arianism was viewed as an anathema, and Arius and supporters were exiled from the church. And Arius and had, if you look it up on your own, but Arius had a very interesting death that was kind of promoted by the Nicaeans as that he was outside God's favor in the way that he died. But we won't get into that here. Ultimately, though, out of the Council of Nicaea, nobody was happy except for the Nicaeans. The Arians weren't happy, and the Origens weren't happy with the results of the Council of Nicaea. So we had these three groups. The Arians kind of played the smart political move in gaining support of the Origens party. When reality is that the Origens were much more closer to the Nicaeans than they were to the Arians. And so because of this confusion between Nicaeans and the Arians would use the Origen party to gain influence over the church for the next 50 years. In fact, this is a very interesting point in that the church and the empire that supported it were very much heavily Arian and began to drift in that direction. But if it wasn't for the defense of men like Athanasius that we're going to look at in the Cappadocian Fathers, it could have gone the other way. But obviously, by the grace of God and through his plan, it wasn't going to go that way. So what ended up happening was Athanasius was the successor of Alexander and as the Bishop of Alexandria. He leads the church and stands firm for the Creed of Nicaea against the Arians for the next 45 years, 17 of which he spends in exile, being banished multiple times. His understanding of the Nicene Creed is important. His understanding of the Son being divine plays a role in his understanding of salvation. Now, this is interesting because this is one of those things that distinguishes Western and Eastern Church. In the West, and especially like myself, I would view that as understanding how we understand with the crucifixion and the atonement there. In the East, it's much more understanding with the incarnation. It's one of those many different things. Like the church in the West really has much more emphasis on soteriology and ecclesiology, where in the East, it's much more emphasized on theology proper, God, the Trinity, and the Christology and the incarnation. And so there's a very strong emphasis by Athanasius on the incarnation of Christ, that Christ had to be both fully human and fully divine, and that Christ must be fully God to make human nature divine, not like mini gods or replacement gods in a sense, but like attaining eternal life. It only makes sense that can take place if the Son of God is fully divine himself. Like I said, there is a persecution that begins to take place by the imperial system that's pro-Arian. And it begins to target men in the Eastern Church. Many bishops are banished, forced into exile, or killed. Hosius of Cordova is tortured at the age of 100, and he is forced to sign a statement on his deathbed supporting Arianism, but he recants before he dies. Hilary of Poitiers is banished as well, forced into exile. But what ends up happening, one of the reasons why the Arians began to lose power, is primarily they began to target Origenists. And so Origenists began to be persecuted as well. And so this forces the Origenists to realize, oh, the Arians can't be trusted and their ideas are flawed. And so the Origenists and the Nicaeans work together to remove the Arians from power. Some key figures too is the Cappadocian Fathers, who unfortunately I really don't have a whole lot of time to get into today, but they were hugely influential in explaining the Trinity, and preaching and teaching on the Incarnation, the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, and all those different aspects and on the divine essence. So definitely read their works, their writings. They were probably the most pivotal figures next to Athanasius in this time period. One of the things, though, that began to be clarified, there's a problem, like I said, language is key. What are you saying when you say something? And so what ends up happening is that there's development of language to help best express the Trinity. So we have ousia, the same of essence, and hypostasis, person. And so the Cappadocian formula is God is three hypostasis, three persons, and one ousia, one essence. Ultimately by Theodosius the First, Theodosius the Great, remember, who made Christianity the only religion in the empire. He also promoted and supported the Nicene believers and issues an edict in 380, making Nicene Christianity the only acceptable form of Christianity. And the Council of Constantinople in 381 reaffirms and strengthens that Nicene Creed. And pretty much Arianism loses out in the church, begins to go in decline. It ultimately, in some sense, disappears, but it constantly reappears in other forms throughout church history in dealing with the Trinity and such. You could say in some sense, Unitarians are tied in a sense to Arianism of the past. Arianism does actually had a mission movement and spread its teachings to the different Germanic tribes, as we'll see later on. So some other important figures that appeared in this time period, you had John Chrysostom, who was born in Antioch in 349. He was well educated as a young man, and so he converts to Christianity at 19, and he joins a hermit community. Unfortunately, though, he really damages his health in this hermit community through constant self-discipline. But John Chrysostom, and Chrysostom is just a kind of a title. It means golden mouth or golden tongue. Becomes a powerful preacher and speaker, is made Bishop of Antioch, and he's well known for his sermons and homilies. You can buy them today. You can read them online for free or get them for Kindle for like $2. But they're easy to read, easy to follow, and meant for like the common person the best to understand. He rose to fame for his preaching and speaking. And so the emperor of Constantinople, the emperor in the East, wanted him to be the patriarch of Constantinople, but he didn't want to cause a riot in Antioch. So what he does is that he kidnaps John Chrysostom and replaces him with a substitute. Of course, the people of Antioch are naturally upset by this, but John Chrysostom just accepts the reality that he is now the patriarch of Constantinople and begins to preach there. He gains popularity among the people of Constantinople, but he also gains the ire of a lot of the clergy in Constantinople. It's the headquarters of the empire, so of course there's wealth and corruption taking place. So John Chrysostom begins to kind of clean house. He begins to take a lot of money and a lot of that wealth and luxury and give it to helping the welfare of the community and such, and building up of churches and monastic communities. So a lot of the clergy began to oppose him. Not all of them, but a good majority of them began to oppose him. But they can't get rid of him because he's favored by the emperor and the empress. He's even opposed by the bishop of the patriarch of Alexandria. Doesn't like John Chrysostom because of all the fame and notoriety he's getting as the patriarch of Constantinople. Doesn't want anybody taking away the power and influence that the patriarch of Alexandria has. And so there kind of is a campaign to have him removed. It fails, but ultimately what ends up doing that gets John Chrysostom in trouble is that in a sermon on speaking against Herodias, the wife of King Herod, who has John the Baptist executed, there's a lot of his enemies tell the empress that, see, he's speaking about you, he's targeting you and all your noble ladies about your wealth and luxury and abuses. He's calling you Queen Herodias, and so now he's out of favor with the imperial family, and so they demand his banishment. But the people of Constantinople refuse; they won't banish him. And so what ends up happening is that to avoid a bloodbath, John Chrysostom willingly goes into exile. Um, he um, he is forced to walk barefoot all the way to the borders of the empire. He dies of a fever, and when he dies, his last words are "All glory be to God." And so his body won't be interned and won't be returned to Constantinople for another 30 years, and finally his bones do return and they're placed within the church itself. So another important figure too is Jerome. Jerome is important as kind of a scholarly figure. He was born in the Balkans. He goes to Rome to be educated in rhetoric, logic, and philosophy. And he forms a monastic community within Rome and begins to attract a lot of aristocrats to his monastic lifestyle in Rome. Because of his advanced education, he knew Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, which is somewhat becoming rare, especially among theologians, to understand Hebrew at this point. He's appointed by Pope Damasus, the Bishop of Rome, to write a Latin Bible, the Vulgate, which means common. And so he begins this 23-year period, because it's not complete until 405, this really long working and development of the Bible into Latin. He collects all these Greek texts and Hebrew texts and begins to try to best translate it over into the Latin. And there's a lot of issues that come out of it, and we address that later on with Erasmus and such later on. But what's also interesting too is that Jerome doesn't necessarily want to include the Apocrypha into the Vulgate, because he opposes the Apocrypha in a sense, because it's not in the Hebrew Old Testament Bible, but is in the Greek Old Testament portion of the Bible. And so because it's not in the Hebrew, it shouldn't be included. Many of his friends and the Pope kind of twist his arm and have him included in there. So he speedily begins to add it in there as well. So that's how the Apocrypha ends up in the Latin Vulgate later on. He leaves Rome, forms a monastic community in Bethlehem, forms a school to educate children. He is a very argumentative figure, writes very eloquently. He was a great communicator, and wrote many other works and commentaries and such. He involved himself in the Pelagian controversy, supporting Augustine, but ultimately he does pass away in Bethlehem in about 420. But his important lasting work is that Latin Vulgate. Now, Augustine is probably without a doubt one of the most important figures in the Western Church. You cannot understand the medieval period without Augustine. You can't understand the Reformation without Augustine. Augustine he doesn't systematize ideas, but a lot of his writings and teachings shape Christian thought for the next 1,000 years. And so you have to understand, if you really want to understand the Western Church and its origins, you have to go to Augustine. Now, Augustine is not an originator of ideas, but kind of carryover of ideas as well, taught by the Apostolic Fathers and the early Church Fathers and such. So you can see through lines of things like original sin and grace to previous individuals that are picked up upon and developed further by Augustine. Augustine is born in North Africa to a Christian mother named Monica and a pagan father. He's educated, wants to become a professor of rhetoric, and does so at Carthage. He's kind of rebellious, especially against his mother. He does treat his mother terribly. It's respect her in some sense, but also leaves her at the docks to escape her in his travels to Rome. And she follows him later on. She, like a good mother, she follows around him all the time to make sure he's being taken care of. Augustine joins the Manichees, but finds flaws in their ideas later on and kind of converts over to Neoplatonism. He rejects Christianity because he can't grapple with a lot of things that are taught in the Old Testament. You have to understand with Neoplatonism and philosophy and its metaphysics, how does it apply with the Old Testament and its connections there and the New Testament and such, and the discrepancies, and he's trying to grapple with these different things. Fortunately for him, he runs into Ambrose in Milan as he's moving from Rome to Milan, and he sits under kind of the sermons and the teachings of Ambrose, and he finds somebody who's intellectually competent that can explain these things to him. And so he kind of has an intellectual conversion there under the teachings of Ambrose. And he understands that Christianity, in some sense, is true, but he doesn't have a kind of spiritual conversion until much later in 385, 386. There's about with the famous story of Tolle Lege, pick up and read. And he reads Romans 13 through 14, and has that new birth experience. But Though probably if you asked Augustine when his conversion was, because it's an anachronistic term to say when we were converted in this time period, he'd probably say he went with his baptism in 386. But anyway, so it wasn't without doubt a pivotal experience in the life of Augustine. And now as a Christian, he puts away. He has not a wife. He has a concubine in a sense that he has a son with, but he puts her away. And him and his son are baptized. They return to North Africa. They sell all their possessions, form a monastic community. He gains notoriety as a speaker and a writer, and eventually is elevated to the Bishop of Hippo. And it's been that position where he begins just tons of outpour of writings and works and sermons and teachings. We only have a small portion of his sermons. There's like 8,000 sermons, and we have only like 500. So we're missing a huge amount. But his ideas and his writings really do shape, especially when he addresses two particular controversies: the Donatist controversy that we kind of addressed earlier at the beginning of this lecture, and the Pelagian controversy. Real quickly on the Donatists, because in North Africa, you had the Catholic Church and you had the Donatist Church. And the Donatist Church declared themselves as the pure church. And the Catholic Church was viewed as the wicked church. Augustine argued that the church is a mixed church and that there's wheats and tares within the church on earth. And the visible church is a mixed church. And so you cannot be saved, though, in his argumentation, you cannot be saved outside the church. That salvation is only found within the church, because that's how he viewed it for himself. And so he made that point of argumentation against the Donatists. He also wrote in support of that the church and the state, working with the church, has every right to bring in schismatics and heretics back in the church by force and violence if necessary. Not against non-Christians. Force and violence should never be used for conversions, but against schismatic and heretics, it can be. And that is also, those 2 points, salvation found only in the church and the use of force and violence against schismatic and heretics, are picked up into the medieval period and then enhanced even further and utilized more so. Then you had the Pelagian controversy. If you're Reformed, you know this controversy very well. Pelagius was a British monk, taught that people were kind of born as a clean slate. You have examples. You have the sinful example of Adam and of the world, and then you have Christ's example, and that we can do good works to attain perfection. And so Augustine addresses these and argues against them, that we are born sinful, argues about original sin. He also begins to argue against Pelagius and says that God is the author of our salvation, and that we do not do good works to attain that salvation. It's by God's grace alone that we are saved. And Pelagian's ideas are ultimately anathematized at the Council of Ephesus in 431. He does try, or this was after Augustine anyway. But prior to that, he does try to get Pelagius condemned, but I think Pelagius ends up escaping banishment and condemnation, luckily for him. But he ends up dying, and his ideas are carried over by his followers. Augustine does argue against the semi-Pelagianists, like John Cassian, but he treats them more as erring brothers than the Pelagians, who he considers as heretics and outside of the church. If you're going to read any of Augustine's writings, I highly recommend the following: the Confessions, the City of God, and then On the Trinity. Confessions is a short work. It's easy to read. It's a credible autobiography of his life and conversion as a Christian and his ideas. So definitely read Confessions if you can. City of God is a much larger work. It was written in response to the fall of Rome in 410 to address the issues of blaming Christians for the fall and end of the empire. He talks about the city of God and the city of man, the differences there, and the implications there. He also, on the Trinity, organizes ideas about the Trinity and how they're going to be taught in the Western Church throughout the medieval period into the present. So he really shapes his ideas on the Trinity. Like I said, without doubt, probably the most important figure to understanding. If you especially want to learn and dive in to this period, you should definitely dive in with Augustine, and definitely a key point, the starting point. So we talked about the Arian controversy. After the Arian controversy, another controversy shows up, and of course it progresses naturally. So we addressed how Christ is God. He is divine. How does that, though? How is Christ, who is fully God, how is that explained with his humanity? How do we how do we grapple with that? How does that work together? So we have two viewpoints that began to develop. And once again, there's a theological viewpoint, and then there's a kind of rivalry between these two camps. You have the Patriarch of Antioch and the Patriarch of Alexandria. And these two camps really collide into each other. Like I said, there's that rivalry, but there's also a theological difference in interpretation. The Antiochians argued that Christ is a real human being, but with distinct separation of human and divine natures. Alexandrians emphasized the divine nature, but uniting the human and divine natures. There's different phases that this Christological controversy goes through. It starts with Apollinaris, who argued that Christ had a divine mind with a human body. He's condemned as a heretic and removed, but his ideas kind of carry on in the East. And then you have Nestorius. Nestorius was the patriarch of Constantinople. Nestorius, unfortunately, you kind of feel sorry for this man, because he runs against Cyril of Alexandria, who we'll talk about here in a second. But Nestorius, one of the things he has a problem with is at this time is that the term for Mary is used as Theotokos, that she is the birth giver of God, or the mother of God. He didn't like that term, and how can a human give birth to God? And grappling with the implications of that, the metaphysics and theology behind that. He preferred the term Christotokos, birth giver of Christ. In a sense that's also true. She is the birth giver of Christ. So he tries to kind of does a compromising act there. But the problem is that he runs afoul of Cyril of Alexandria. Of all the figures in this early church period, he's one of the most vicious, argumentative, aggressive individuals of the church. Brilliant thinker, no doubt about that. Very brilliant thinker, but also one of the most violent agitators. So probably one of the worst people you can have as your enemy against you. And so Cyril of Alexandria said that Christ had one physis, or one nature. He understood physis meaning nature. But also Cyril understand that Christ was both human and divine. But he hears Nestorius say that Christ had two physises. And so what he's hearing is that Christ was two persons. And so like there's a duality split involving asceticism and things like that. And so that these might be Gnostic interpretations. And so Cyril began to kind of campaign against Nestorius. And so at the Council of 431, he has Nestorius banished. Nestorius goes off into exile. Now, the people will say, okay, well, then he founded the Nestorian church. Actually, the Nestorian church was founded by his followers, not so him later on. And they don't prefer to call themselves Nestorian church. It's really the Church of the East. That idea, Nestorians and his followers' ideas, though, do carry on in the East, and they actually spread as far as China to 600 AD, though they kind of get purged out in 800 AD, though Nestorianism, or the Church of the East, does exist to the present day. There's another involvement with the Robber Council of Ephesus later on, a couple years later, where Eutyches and Eutychianism, if you see in the image above, that Jesus had one blended nature, gets promoted. Ultimately, though, there's a conflict breaks out again, and really it's not resolved until the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which resolves this whole controversy and tries to once again correct the language that Christ was one person, using hypostasis again, but with two natures, fully human and fully divine. And if, like I say, if you look at the chart here, it really shows how we should understand the Orthodox view of Jesus, that he is one person with two natures, truly God, truly human. And any deviation of any of that kind of leads you off into different heretical groups. Now, by this point, by the 450s and such, Rome has begun to collapse, and the West more so than the East. You have to understand, like I said, demographics, geography, all that plays a role. Western Rome is not as financially wealthy. It's politically strong and vibrant as in the East. And so it's open to invasions, corruptions within, and invasions without. And so these different Germanic tribes who existed and had contact with the Romans began to feel pressure by the Huns as the Huns began to push in on them. And so they naturally began to push into the empire. And so we have these different periods of invasions that began to take place, starting within the 300s AD and into the 400s. The Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and so on. The Roman island of Britain is abandoned by the Roman army by a general to gain victory in a civil war, which he doesn't. So the island is pretty much abandoned and is open for invasions by the Angles and Saxons. But what's interesting is that most of these Germanic tribes, as they're moving in, are either pagans or Aryans. And so naturally, in a sense, what ends up happening is there is some, and not others, there is persecution conducted by the Aryan Germanic tribes because not because they're Romans, but because they're Catholics. And then, of course, the Anglo-Saxons because they're pagans, pagans versus Christians. Some key events in the fall of the Roman Empire. One is the sacking of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 under Alaric. After that the sacking actually wasn't as destructive as the Vandal sacking in 455. But still, nonetheless, it was symbolic because Rome hadn't been sacked by a foreign tribe for 1,000 years. And so a lot of people within the empire viewed it as kind of the end of the world, that, the Rome, the mother of the world, has been killed, and that, what are we going to do? And so there was, in a sense, a symbolic ending to the empire at this point. So, but some historians don't say that the empire ended. There's still a Western Roman emperor. Rome was a symbolic capital. The imperial capital had moved to Ravenna, which was kind of north of Venice. So the Roman capital and Roman imperial government in the West still continued to exist. The Visigoths moved into southern France and then finally into Spain. And then what they would do was they were kind of hired out as mercenaries. And then you had other Germanic tribes, like I said, the Vandals moved into France, Spain, and then settled in North Africa, forming their own kingdom, sacking Rome in 455, which was really destructive for Rome. And Rome kind of really never recovered from that. And then finally, you had the German general Odovaker in 476, who removed and overthrew the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, which historians find coincidental because it's just amazing that the last emperor is named after the first king of Rome and then the first emperor of Rome. And by this point, too, a lot of German generals were considered the real powers behind the throne in the Western Roman Empire. And a lot of these different kingdoms, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Franks, and others, claimed subservience to managing the lands in the West, and that the Roman emperor was the true master over these lands. But really, it was all just a name. Really, the power was held by these different Germanic tribes. But with the removal of the last Roman emperor in the West, and that is considered by most historians as the end point of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continues onwards. Then some argue that 1204 with the sacking in the Fourth Crusade, or 1453 with the Ottomans taking Constantinople as the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. But that's debatable. But one important fact is that the Frankish king Clovis accepts Catholicism in 496. This is a huge shift because now a pagan kingdom has now converted over to Catholicism, not Arianism, but Catholicism. Clovis said that he would convert if he was given victory in battle by the Catholic God against another Germanic tribe like the Alemanni, which does happen. He wins. And so in 496, he and then his people convert over to Catholicism, which will play a role in its relationship with the Western Church and the Bishop of Rome. Some important figures. Gregory of Tours is where we get a lot of our information about what's going on in this time period. He writes the history of the Franks, and he's the Bishop of Tours in France. So he really tries to work to help convert these pagan Franks over to Catholicism and try to really clean out a lot of the pagan ideas, because even though they were converting over to Christianity, they were still bringing in a lot of their pagan traditions into the church. And so he tried to begin to work the clean house, so to speak, of really working on developing the Catholic Church in the Frankish lands. Boethius is another important figure. One of the things you can always tell if you want to understand where the Christian mind is today, what are people reading besides their Bibles? What are Christians reading? And so in the medieval period, one of the things that was the most popular read book was Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius, like Gregory Tours, both of them were Roman aristocrats, well-educated. Boethius actually traveled to Athens and Alexandria. So the people were still traveling, even with all this kind of chaos and confusion taking place. And so he was well educated. He ran afoul of Theodoric, the king of Italy, the Ostrogothic king of Italy, and was put into prison. And while in prison, he wrote his Consolation of Philosophy that deals with God's providence and suffering, and deals with a lot of Neoplatonist ideas. And a lot of these ideas are carried over and picked up into that medieval period. Another thing that Boethius does is he develops the education system that's going to be used by the medieval period as well, in the trivium and the quadrivium. Trivium is logic, rhetoric, grammar, and quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And all these things will help shape bishops and leaders in the church and have that educational foundation to play an influential role. But Boethius really builds those two things, and those things have an impact as well into the church later on. Some other important figures too, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian tries to rebuild the Roman Empire, but fails, almost gets close, but fails to do so. He defeats the Vandals in North Africa, reacquires North Africa, launches an invasion against Italy, reconquers most of Italy. It's his campaigns in Italy that really reduced the Italian population. I mean, it's the most destructive campaigns on the Italian peninsula. And so that more so than any Germanic invasion set the Italian people back in this time period was Justinian's invasions. But the impact, some of the things religious one is that he built the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. He tried to deal himself with the Christological controversies with as we're going to see here in a little bit with the Monophysites or the Miaphysites. But one of the things he does is that he helps using with the help of Pope Gregory the Great, convert the Visigoths and Lombards over to Catholicism. And then finally, another important figure is Benedict of Nursia. Benedict of Nursia goes to Rome to be educated, sees the sin and corruption in the city, flees the city, forms his own monastic community in Monte Cassino, and as a monk, to help drive away his sexual desires, he rolls himself in a bed of thorns. But what's important to understand about Benedict of Nursia is that he creates the Benedictine rule. And this rule is what is kind of used as the central point for all monastic rules going forward, is that because it's very simple, it organizes a daily routine that monks should follow, an organization of electing an abbot to lead the monastic community. And so it is very basic and easy to read and easy to follow. And so because of its simplicity, it becomes very popular in a lot of monastic communities that appear in Western Europe are initially are Benedictine monasteries as well. But it's all thanks to this individual, Benedict of Nursia. So our last main figure that we're going to look at is Pope Gregory the Great, because this is the figure that really kind of, as we end this late antiquity and go into the medieval period, this last important figure to really kind of take a look at. Pope Gregory the Great was another Roman aristocrat. Like I said, a lot of people still consider themselves Romans, even as the Roman Empire fell. Came from a Roman noble family, was well-educated, raised up to be a civil servant, served in the city of Rome, left to become a monk, then served even as a papal ambassador to the courts of Constantinople, came back, became an abbot, and then was finally chosen as Bishop of Rome. He really strengthened the papacy's political and spiritual role. One of the things that he did, he was very much pro-Augustinian, but he began to incorporate outside ideas and ideas from the people into the church as well. He wrote on pastoral care. He was really concerned with bishops and presbyters or priests really taking care of their flock in the church and how they can do that, how should they do that. He was really focused on administering church lands. Remember, like I said, there was a conflict in the Italian peninsula and lands outside the peninsula in France and Spain and others, and how to manage these territories and lands. So he was really delving into administrative aspects that some would form together, become the papal states. He helped establish relationship with the Franks, which will be key later on too, with the development of the papacy and the Frankish kingdom with Charlemagne. And for some other things too, is that Melanchthon argued that Pope Gregory is the starting point of the superstition being introduced into the church. In some ways, because you see purgatory, which you see some elements in like the writings of Augustine, but really become to the forefront with Pope Gregory the Great. He introduces purgatory. He also introduces the argument that if you commit sins after your baptism, that you need to do good works of love to remove the guilt of those sins, to remove those works of sin by works of love. So we see right there the idea of some sort of enhancement with penance. You also see the communion for the saints, of the dead saints, prayer for the saints being introduced with Pope Gregory the Great. And then, though he did oppose the use of icons in the church, he didn't promote it. He thought they were good teaching aids, but he really opposed the teachings of icons, the use of icons within the church as well. But one of the things about Gregory was that he really believed in evangelism. He really thought that the end times were here, and believed that it was that the goal of the church should be to spread the church as far as it can before the return of Christ. Also, one other thing is that Pope Gregory also was very angry that the Patriarch of Constantinople received the title of Universal Patriarch or Universal Bishop. He said that there is no universal bishop, that bishops are kind of first among equals and leaders in the church, but that if anybody uses the title of universal bishop or supreme bishop, is that they are the Antichrist. So a lot of Catholic apologists, they kind of talk it away and such like that. But I always find it interesting that even the own Bishop of Rome opposed the use of the term of a universal bishop. But anyway, like I was getting at is that so because of that, he encouraged missions and evangelisms. And one of the most important ones is the one to Great Britain or England, because remember, Anglo-Saxons have invaded the British Isles at this time. And so a lot of paganism was reintroduced back into the island. And so wanting to bring in Christianity, he receives, there's two different stories. One is he receives a letter from King Ethelbert of Kent and kind of an invitation. Another is the story of the slaves in the market of Rome who are Angles, and he asks who they are. They say they're Angles. He said, no, you're angels, and has a desire to have them converted. But nonetheless, he sends a man named Augustine, a Benedictine monk, and 3 others to help spread Christianity to the island. But Augustine doesn't want to go. He refuses, and he tries to stop every kind of like takes a long time going through France to eventually get over to England. But the Pope Gregory has to kind of encourage him every step of the way to get him there. He does. Augustine gets there. It's a huge success in Kent. The king converts over to Christianity, and Augustine is made the Archbishop of Canterbury. So we see the birth of that position for the future Anglican Church right there with Augustine of Canterbury. But what's interesting is that the Catholic Church, now that's reintroduced to the British Isles, runs into Celtic Christianity. Now, remember, there were Christians in the British Isle, but after the Roman army left, and the Anglo-Saxons were coming in, there were still Christians there, but they began to retreat to places like Wales in the southern part of England, or to Ireland and other places. And so they kind of continued their Christian practices, and they kind of formed a form of Celtic Christianity. Some doctrinal deviations a little bit, but primarily some big differences is that they were led by abbots and not by bishops. They didn't want to fall under Roman tradition. It wasn't until the Synod of Whitby that really kind of reunites the Celtic Christians with the Roman bishops, and Roman tradition kind of gains overhead of the Celtic Christians. But it's important because a lot of Celtic Christians and Irish monks and others came to the continent of Europe and helped spread Christianity, and were major players in the missions movement. So it was in a positive sense, because they kind of, with reunification, they kind of came back in and helped spread Christian teachings. One final theologian to look at very quickly is the Venerable Bede, one of the most educated figures in Europe at this point, can speak Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Like I said, both Greek and Hebrew, especially now being even more so rare in the West. He would have written works come from like Monte Cassino and other monasteries to his monastery in England. What's important about him is that we get a lot of historical writings from him, like the church history of the English people, that kind of show the history of the English people up to this point in time. It kind of gives us a view of what life was like. He also wrote the Gospel of John in early English, Old English. And so he had many different commentaries and writings on different works. So he was another important theologian in his writings and such that kind of bridges the connection between the end of the early church into the medieval period. And one final look in the East is just some final Eastern controversies. Like I said, no one seems to ever be happy with end of any council. It doesn't seem that, well, except for the people who won the council, there is no happiness. The Council of Chalcedon pretty much cemented, like I said, that Christ is one person with two natures, fully God and fully man. But the monophysites, who prefer to call themselves miaphysites now, reject the outcome of the Council of Nicaea, and so they really began to form into hold on here, let's see. So the monophysites are not particularly happy about the outcome of the Council of Chalcedon, but what they end up doing, so they kind of form their own regional churches, the Coptic churches, and the Syriac churches, and even the spreading into the Ethiopian church. Monotheism, or not monotheism, the monophysites really gain hold there, and so that's why today, they prefer the term miaphysites. That's why they are separate regional churches from the Eastern Orthodox, and also because of their opposition to the Chalcedonian Church, the Chalcedonian Creed. When Islam comes in and invades, they have an easier acceptance of Islamic overlordship than being under the thumb of the Chalcedonian Church. Some appearance of the writings of pseudo Dionysius. Dionysius the Areopagite was one of the converts in Athens with the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. Supposedly these were his writings. Scholars obviously say these are not his writings. They appear later. That's why it's called the writings of pseudo Dionysius. It's important because it shapes the spiritualism that appears in the Eastern Church, and it does kind of carry over into the West. But the pseudo Dionysius says that we can only understand God through the negative way, the way of negation. And that, for example, we say God is infinite. We mean that he's not finite. The ways of negation, we can only understand God by the ways that things he is not. But it also kind of extends that even further, that we cannot know God through reason or our senses or experience. It's a mystery. And so there is that spiritualism that takes place of God can only be known by not knowing. And so that really kind of takes hold and spreads in the Eastern Church, which is why you see a heavy emphasis on the mystery and spiritualism in the Eastern Orthodox Church today. There is also, like I said, another controversy that finally appears. It's the monotheliite controversy. It has a lot of important figures that end up in this debate. Maximus the Confessor, who you see here, he's another important figure in the Eastern Church. So if you understand Origen, Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, and Gregory of Palamas, you really understand the key figures in the Eastern Orthodox Church. The monotheliite controversy says that Christ is one person with two natures, human and divine, but only one will. Versus the ditheliite position, which Christ is one person, fully God, fully man, with two wills, a human will and divine will. And so the Third Council of Constantinople declares the monotheliites to be a heretical group. And so the ditheliite position is what is upheld by both Eastern and Western churches to this day. And so now we finally come to the end of our early church. And so now we are finally set up for understanding where we are in the medieval period. And you can see here the breakdown of the empire. The church does still exist. It's even though we call this period the Dark Ages, it's still technically not the end of the church. The church does continue. There are elements of superstition, and unfortunately, there is an abundance of man's tradition over replacing grace. But grace does continue to exist. And does continue to be taught. And there are, like I said, there is a connection here as we move into the medieval period and then eventually into Protestantism with the Reformation. But I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. And like I said, you can always reach out to me and let me know if there are any questions that you might have. Thank you.